Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for that. I love short introductions. That's great. Yeah, we did when we tried to make sure Alan couldn't be here because that way we can talk about him while he's not here. I've served with Alan in the state legislature for a couple of years. I like Alan because he always made Gary and me look like we had really good hair. And they told me this is going to be a friendly crowd, which I think is probably the case. Not only did I serve with Alan and with Gary, my state rep is here. Where's Brandon Newton? Brandon, where are you sitting? So that kid represents my family back home. In fact, that's the seat I used to be in, and I think the first campaign you worked on was mine when he was about 9 years old. Anyway, thanks for having me here. I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes because I'm more interested in your questions than in what I have to say because I've heard myself give this speech a couple times. But I want to talk about the value that ALEC brings, and someone who has seen it now from both sides, having been in the state legislature and now been in the federal legislature and now in the administration, to see the value that ALEC brings in a couple of different ways. First of all, I wouldn't be doing my job, I don't think, if I talked about the fact that the administration is having a really good first 2 years. Things are going fairly. The boss asks me all the time, thank you. He says, Mick, how are we doing? Every time I go in the Oval Office, how are we doing? I'm like, well, you know, the taxes are going great, dereg is going, everything's, you know, the economy is everything that we said it was going to be. And when I talk to groups like this, I remind them, what does that mean? That means that the conservative ideas are winning, which is all we've ever asked for, right? Is the chance to prove that our ideas, our thoughts about how you should govern yourself were superior to the folks who are offering something else. And it's so satisfying to sit here and say, okay, yeah, look, if you do let people keep more of their own money, you lower the taxes, you make the taxes simpler, maybe you change the incentives to allow businesses to invest in themselves, for people to invest in themselves. If you deregulate a little bit and you get off of people's backs. I used to be in the restaurant business, and I can tell you that one of my greatest fears was, you know, what would the government do that week to try and put me out of business, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And you start to change that, things get a little better. When you start to become energy independent, maybe even energy dominant, when you do these things that conservatives have talked about for a long time, sort of limiting, we don't want to talk as much now about limiting the role of government, but getting government in its lane and getting government to sort of focus on its priorities and not having government in everything and letting individuals and businesses, which are nothing more than individuals associating together, do more, things work better. And the proof is in the pudding. Much to the chagrin of the folks who are not here today. I've always laughed when I start to think about some of the things that the left said about our policies before we put them into place. I don't know Paul Krugman personally. We do have a giant life-size picture of him in my office. He's famous for saying a couple things when we introduced the first budget. The budget that I introduced for the president back in, I think it was March of 2017, was the first place we started talking about this sustained 3% economic growth. And I know that's really boring to talk about economic growth because people don't care about GDP numbers and percentages and all that. But what I remind people of is that there's a big difference between a 3% American economy and a 2% American economy. I can put it to you in terms of the size of the deficits, the number of jobs, the opportunities for people. It's a big difference between those two things. I used to laugh. Gary and I know Trey Gowdy very well. Trey's a tremendous litigator, a great prosecutor, a terrible mathematician. And I was helping him talk one day, his talking points about 3% versus 2%. He said, Mick, what's the big difference? There's only 1% difference. I'm like, no, it's not. It's 50% difference between 3% and 2%. So we don't let Trey talk math very often. But this is how I explain it to people. There's a couple folks in here who fit this description. Brandon is one of them. If you're under 30 years old, this is the first time in your adult life that you've actually experienced what a healthy American economy is supposed to look like. Okay? And it was 1.9%, 2%, and we told that was going to be the way it was forever. That was one of the most depressing things I ever heard because I know what a 3% economy looks like. I know what a 3.5% economy looks like. And I know we get accused as conservatives of talking too much time about numbers. We should talk more about people and stories, but there is a number that I always like to talk to groups about, always point out. We track something that no one knows we track. We track what's called the quit rate. Now, everybody knows that we follow unemployment, right? The number of people who've been separated from their jobs. In that data, down deeper in that data, is the number of people who've been separated from their job by their own free will. They quit. all right? They didn't get laid off, they didn't get fired, they quit. That number is up, I think, every single month for the last 6 or 8 or 12 months. It's a huge increase over the course of this administration. What does that tell you? What does that tell you about what a 3% growth economy means? It tells you that people believe in the economy again, they believe in the country again, they believe the government's not out to get them, and they believe in themselves. If you're willing to quit your job to go to another job, if you're willing to quit your job to move cities, if you're willing to quit your job to start your own business, that speaks of a certain confidence that has been lacking in the American economy for 10 years before we got here. And it is just proof positive to me that things are working. The reason I mentioned Krugman was he was the one who said that when we first introduced that concept of 3%, he said, you know, I'm really disturbed about the fact that not only is there no one within the Trump administration who's smart enough to understand what they're talking about? That was me he's talking about. He said, they're not even smart enough to talk to the people who are smart enough to know what they're talking about. I assume that meant him. And then he went on to say that you could make, and this is him speaking now, you could make me complete dictator of the country and I would do everything I know what to do and I could not raise GDP by more than a couple of tenths of a percentage point. That's actually the only true statement he said for the last couple of months. There's a lot of folks invested in seeing our ideas fail, in seeing conservatism fail. It's the reason you don't hear the media talking about the successes with the tax bill. You don't hear them talking about the successes in deregulation. They can't. They can't talk about those successes because they're heavily invested in another idea, which is that government needs to be bigger and do more for you. And if our ideas are proven to be correct, what are they going to sell you next time? So I encourage you not to be discouraged and to know that your ideas, our ideas, the conservative ideas that we share are actually proving correct and they are winning in Washington, D.C. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about what doesn't work, which is our government doesn't work very well at the federal level. I don't know if this comes as much surprise. And I could give you, I gave a speech to Hillsdale College for about an hour and a half one time and talked nothing about how government was broken. I'm going to give you the real short version, talk about one thing that's broken, which is spending. I think I made it, to the extent I have a reputation in this town, it's for being a deficit hawk. I think I still have that. I've spent a lot of time trying to get more people focused on the debt and the deficit and the spending levels. And they always ask me, Mulvaney, you know, you haven't reduced spending yet. You're focusing all on growth. And I'm like, yeah, I am. The deficit is just a two-variable equation. It's the amount of money you take in less the amount of money you spend. And if you spend more than you take in, you have a deficit. Deficit accumulates, that's the debt, right? And they said, why aren't you focused more on spending? I'm like, I tried. President and I tried. The president released what I consider to be two of the most fiscally responsible budgets ever in the last 2 years, and Congress immediately threw them in the trash. That's probably not surprising. Most Congresses throw most presidential budgets in the trash, all right? Everybody say, oh, this is a dead letter. Yeah, they all are. Senator Leahy called me when I introduced the first budget. He said, son, don't feel bad. This budget is no more dead on arrival than the other 46 I've seen since I've been here. That's not what's got me discouraged. What's got me discouraged is to see this structural deficiency that we face at the federal level when it comes to our ability to reduce our spending. The reason I spend all of my time talking about growth and trying to grow the economy is because that helps part of that equation, right? That money in. And the bigger the economy is, the richer you are, the richer the government gets, okay? So that's why I'm focused on that part of the equation. Why am I not spending as much time talking about spending? Because I know how Washington works. And let me tell you how it works. I'll give you some specific examples of how this town is broken and why we need your help. 2 years ago, I introduced a concept in the first draft of the budget that said, look, we're going to look at the National Institute of Health grants, the ones that go to all major universities. This is a very high-profile proposal that we made. The proposal, I thought, was fairly modest. Simply said, look, if you get a grant from the Gates Foundation will limit you to about 10% on your overhead. You have to use 90% of that grant for the actual research that you're doing. If you get it from the federal government, you can spend, north of 30% on your administrative costs, and maybe less than 70 actually goes to research. And I had what I thought was a fairly reasonable proposal, which is that we were going to lower that cap on administrative costs down to, say, 20% for sake of this discussion. Now, could have spent less money overall and actually increased our spending on research. I thought this was a good conservative principle. Congress ignores it. That's fine. That's what they do. But it went an extra step further. And in every appropriation bill they have passed since then, they have made it literally illegal for me to propose that again. I'm not allowed to spend any taxpayer money reviewing the overhead rates on the National Institute of Health grants. Okay? They won't even let me spend money on trying to figure out a way to save money. I just found a budget, I just found some language in a bill that they're going to vote on the next couple of weeks that tells me how to spend my own money at the Office of Management and Budget. They're going to give me a couple $1 million, but say that I have to spend it on these 3 people. Think about that for a second. That's the legislative branch of government telling the executive branch of government not only that it has to spend the money, but how to spend the money. There's another provision in another bill in foreign affairs that says not only do I have to spend $20 million on this program, okay, and I have to spend it by this date, but this person, this individual at the State Department has to be the person who administers that money. Okay? The legislature's got things all out of whack. The basic theme of my speech at Hillsdale was that the legislature's got things completely turned around. They give us too much authority where they should not. They give us all this authority in regulatory abilities and rulemakings when they should keep that for themselves, because that's really essentially the same thing as making law. And yet they micromanage the way that we operate the executive branch, which is the worst possible way for them to spend their time. I can tell you at great length how difficult it is to lay off or fire a government employee, but you probably know about that as well as anybody. Why do I say all of this? This is actually where you can help us. I don't think we're going to be able to fix a lot of those structural deficiencies in Washington, D.C. I don't know if we're going to be able to curb the spending despite our best efforts. Simply because no elected member of Congress has ever lost his or her job for borrowing money. That's my guess is what they will continue to do. And we will continue to have a spending problem in Washington, D.C. I will spend all the time I can on growing the economy along with the rest of the administration, but the spending is not going to solve itself. If there's any real hope for fiscal discipline in this country, it's with you folks. It just is. I think everybody in the room has a balanced budget amendment. There may be 1 or 2 of you who don't. I have been through a state legislative process when we went through the recession and had to reduce spending because we just didn't have the money. And lo and behold, South Carolina still exists today. Y'all know you can do it, okay? And every time you do it, it sets the example for us, okay? When you actually prioritize spending, okay? When you get rid of wasteful spending, when you sit and go through your budget and say, do we really need to do this? It proves to us that it can be done. We have ignored you for a long time. We may continue to ignore you, but it's still valuable to have the example there. Many of our federal lawmakers come from this group. I don't know how many folks in the state in the United States Congress and Senate are former state legislators. Is it 99 folks? I mean, that's where they're going to learn how to conduct themselves. So the more you folks actually put those conservative, fiscally responsible principles to work, the more influence you can have over us, which is what ALEC is really about, right? I mean, we look to you for ideas. It's what we did in South Carolina when we were there. It's like, what are you all doing in Missouri? What are you doing in Montana that might work in South Carolina? So we look to you for ideas. We look to you for examples of stuff that works and, yes, stuff that doesn't work. It's one of the great things about the Great American Experiment. If you try something in Idaho and it fails, it serves as an educational experience for everybody else in the country. And then finally, talking to people. I don't have much influence over federal lawmakers. As much as I'd like to think that I do, you have a lot more than I do because they know who you are. You live in their district. Ralph Norman, good friend of mine, and Brendan Newton's. He succeeded me in the 5th congressional seat from South Carolina. And I could get on my high horse and call him from the Office of Management Budget and say, Ralph, I need you to do this. So what Ralph knows is that I live here now, okay? When he goes home and he goes to the York County, South Carolina Republican Party annual or monthly meeting on Thursday night at the whatever hotel it is on I-77, Brandon is going to be there, along with 15 people that volunteer on his campaign. And if they are the ones who put pressure on him to do the right thing, and actually with Ralph you don't have to push very hard because he's a pretty conservative guy. But if you are the folks who are there at the grassroots level talking to these folks saying, look, Don't change when you go to DC. Keep these conservative principles. You know they work because they work back home. Please figure out a way to take the good ideas from the states, take them up to the federal level. That's all we can ask, Alec. And y'all do a tremendous job at it. And I'll just close by saying thanks, because we do look to you. And you are an example to all of us at the federal level of stuff that works, stuff that doesn't work, good ideas, bad ideas. But we need all the help that we can get if we're going to solve some of the very real challenges that we face. Anyway, they told me to take questions for about half an hour or so. I'd much rather do that. I think there's folks walking around with, I hope there's folks walking around with microphones. Who's in charge of this? Yes, sir. Oh, you've got the microphone, right?
Hi, Isaac from South Dakota. Could you talk about line item veto real quick?
Yeah, sure. It's real quick. I think it's unconstitutional, isn't it? I think didn't they pass a line item veto of some fashion in the 1990s, and the Supreme Court said it violated the, I can't remember what clause it was, the part about this shall sign the bills or something like that. So unless you change the Constitution, you're probably not going to get that. We'd love to have it. You absolutely know that we would. I deal with with the president all the time. You go through these examples, you get these bills that are literally this big, and is there some stuff in there that the president's not going to like? Absolutely. But it's a question of either sign the bill and take all the bill, or veto the bill and veto the whole thing. So we'd love to have that flexibility, but I think that's probably that's a longer term option than I think most of us realize.
Hi, I'm from Maryland. We have similar problems when the legislature tries to micromanage the governor.
Yeah.
And in your example, one of the things that I generally say is that's unconstitutional separation of powers. Is that something that you've thought about or done?
Is there press here for this? I think there is. Yes, there's press here. So what do I say? Give me the politically correct answer. And what I'm not going to say that I'm absolutely going to challenge it. No, what I'm going to say is that, do we think there's places where the legislature has overstepped? Sure. Do I think that the federal legislature really has the right to dictate to the administration not only how much money to spend, where to spend it, when to spend it, but who, by office, a specific person in the executive branch that has to administer that program? Yeah, I think that's probably an overreach. And do I think we'll look for opportunities to raise that issue with the legislature? Yes. That's the nicest way I can say that.
Yes, sir. I'm Noel Campbell, a state representative from Arizona. Since Social Security is owed about a third of the national debt, I think that's pretty close to say that a third of our national debt is owed to Social Security. So are there any proposals from the administrations to rectify Social Security by extending retirement age or?
Yeah. The reason I looked at you quizzically is because I don't think that's factual. And I think a lot of folks, by the way, I've had this discussion with Paul Ryan as recently as yesterday. And he's a good friend. What little I know about the federal budget, I learned from Paul Ryan. I was on the budget committee when he was chairman. And I think as Republicans in Washington, we've done such a good job of convincing ourselves that the mandatory programs, the entitlement programs, specifically Social Security and Medicare, are the drivers of the debt, that we forgot what's really driving the debt. The deficit this year is going to be just over $1 trillion. I think the deficit in Social Security next year is going to be about $82 billion. It's less than 10% of the overall deficit next year. I think Medicare is just north of $300 billion next year. So even together, those two things are less than half of what's driving our deficit next year. What's driving our deficit next year is discretionary spending. We raised discretionary spending 2 years ago by 13% in a single year. Okay, we just did. We went from $1 trillion to $1.3 trillion. It's a 1.13. It's just stunning the rate at which Congress has grown the discretionary part of the budget. By the way, I know I've sort of delved down into geekdom now. The discretionary part of the budget is the stuff that we budget for. It's USDA, FBI, DOD, sort of the alphabet soup. The other stuff is mandatory or entitlement spending, Medicare, Medicaid. We don't budget for that. So when you hear us talk about our budget's about $1 trillion, just north of $1 trillion, 1.3 actually. We spend about $4. $4 trillion. The rest of it is that mandatory stuff. So you hear us talk about budget and discretionary. It's the stuff we actually put in the budget every single year, and we can change the numbers. We don't change the numbers on Social Security. You turn 67 or whatever it is, you get your dough, right? You're above 65, you need the knee surgery, you get it, right? We don't budget for that. But the discretionary spending is really what's driving the deficit now. You're absolutely right that in the long term, those two mandatory programs, Social Security and Medicare, are what drive the deficit in the coming years. And there is no getting around that. There's no question about that. What I've pointed out to folks is that last year, the president's budget was the largest proposed reduction in mandatory spending in history and did not touch retirement of Social Security or primary benefits in Medicare. That's how big our spending programs are. There's so much that you can reduce within Medicare, even within Social Security and within all the other Medicare programs, and not touch what everybody thinks is the core programs. That's how big these programs are. I'll give you a classic example. Raise your hand if everybody in here pays Medicare taxes, right? You pay your FICA. Raise your hand if you knew that some of that money was going to pay graduate medical school tuition. Okay? It is. There's one that was probably a doctor, who knows that, right? Or works for a hospital. Here's what happened is that years ago there was so much money in these trust funds that lawmakers went to them and said, you know what, there's a pot of money, I want to go get that. How familiar does that sound, right? And they decided to take Medicare money and use it for stuff that is outside the core Medicare. The best example of this, by the way, is the Highway Trust Fund, which is now used for things like bike lanes and flowers and signs. It was supposed to be used for roads and bridges, right? So there's example after example of things like that. So you can fix Medicare, you can reform and save a ton of money in Medicare and Social Security and not touch the primary pillars for the next several years. You're absolutely right. In the long term, you have to fix those things. The president has asked me to fix the easy stuff first. Because if we can't get agreement in Washington, D.C., that maybe Medicare funds shouldn't be used for graduate medical tuition, and bad debts at private hospitals from non-Medicare patients, I'm not making that up, if we can't get agreement on that, then the chances of fixing the larger pillars of those programs are probably zero. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Eric. I'm from Washington, D.C., unfortunately, like you are. Other than being the head of OMB, you're also...
No, let me be perfectly clear. I still live in South Carolina. I just don't go home nearly as much. So,
other than being the head of OMB...
And Brandon, I still vote there. Thank you very much. That's right. So.
Other than being head of OMB, you're also head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Can you talk about some of the deregulatory steps you've taken with that possibly unconstitutional agency?
Yeah, and the first thing I tell people is I changed the name just because, and I know people think it was a stunt, and it wasn't really, but it sort of turned into this cause for me. I used to be the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I changed the name to the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. Why? Not because I'm a jerk, just because that's what the law says. When you open up Dodd-Frank and get to, I think it's Title 10, you open it up, it says, the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. And you go to the first line of the statute, it says, there is established a Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. And I tried to bring this culture to the Bureau. It's like, look, we're going to do what the law says. Okay? We're not going to do what we wish the law says. We're not going to do what we want to do. We're going to look at the law. If the law says do X, Y, and Z, we're going to do X, Y, Z. If we want to do A, B, and C, and it's not in the statute, we're not going to do that anymore. And I thought that changing the name to be consistent with the statute was maybe a good way to send the message. So I think that the things that we've done over there is, it doesn't get much press. I've actually been pleasantly surprised with the culture change we've been able to put in place at the Bureau. I mean, well over 90% of the folks who worked, about 1,700 people worked there. Actually, it's down to about 1,500 now. That's a great story, by the way. There's actually three, I'll put my budget hat back on for a second. There's 3 agencies in Washington, D.C. that will actually spend less money this year than they did last year and employ fewer people this year than they did last year. Wait. All 3 of them are non-appropriated, okay, including the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. Where I get to set the budget, and the other ones, and I won't tell you what they are because it makes a difference, but the other ones, they don't get appropriated money from Congress. Okay? So if you let the Trump administration and his appointees run an agency, we'll do it cheaper and with fewer people and do it better. If you run it through Congress, they'll end up spending more money. and actually dictating the number of full-time employees equivalents we have to have. Anyway, so that's another story. But I've been very pleased with the culture that we've been able to put in place. I think now people pay very close attention to the statute, you know, and they're actually enforcing the law as it is written. I've encouraged Congress to take a close look at the statute. The statute was passed in a hurry. It's not handed down on high on stone tablets. It can be fixed. My favorite story is going to Congress for my first testimony as the Bureau acting director, and I said, look, I'm sitting here and I'm reading the statute, and it says that I have to be here, that I shall appear before Congress. It says shall appear before Congress, and I'm here to appear before Congress. Now, if I look at this other section of the statute, there's somebody else, another person who has to appear and answer questions, and then another part of the statute, it says somebody has to appear and respond to inquiries. Right? I only have to appear. And the lawyers in the room know what I'm getting ready to say, which is that if it's specific as to appear and testify, appear and answer questions, and I just have to appear, I don't have to answer any questions. They didn't like that very much. I did answer their questions, but I use that as an example that, look, the statute needs to be fixed. And I think that's the other thing we've pointed out to people at the bureaus. Like, look, this thing is not perfect. We are going to operate the bureau to the statute. If Congress does not like what we're doing, they can change the statute. Whether or not they will is another story. My guess is they probably won't. They made some small changes to it last year. But I mean, I've asked for an independent Inspector General. That's it. That's one of my modest things that I have asked for. But Elizabeth Warren thinks that's too contentious, and that's just me trying to undermine and dissolve the entity. So no, it's actually a year yesterday that I was at the Bureau, and I think it's been a very productive year. I think we've sent a message that you can protect people, you can protect consumers, because the law says thou shalt protect consumers. We're going to do that. By the way, there's 5 things we're supposed to do. You actually go to the statute and you read it and it says, what shall we do? The first thing we're supposed to do is educate consumers. Then we protect consumers. Then there's another thing we're supposed to do, which is review the industries that we have jurisdiction over for unduly burdensome regulations and try and get rid of them. That's actually in the statute. So that's one of the things we've started to do. I think it's been a very productive year. I look forward to Kathy Kraninger getting confirmed maybe as early as tomorrow to replace me. So. Who else? By the way, the clock went to 0, so I don't know what that means. If I'm supposed to leave now, Gary, we're done. Okay, we're done. Look, when Alan comes in, what can we have him say about Alan?
Well, you know, now we can probably tell Mike Pence to release the traffic and let Alan come back.
So yeah, Mike was on the Hill today. I saw Mike's banner out in the lobby. It says "I was Alec before it was cool to be Alec," so that's great. And it is cool to be an Alec, and if there's one thing y'all remember when I leave here, because usually I don't make much sense, what you do does count, and we need you to continue to do it. There is value in what this organization does. There are people here in Washington, D.C. who do look to you for information, who care about what you're doing, who look to you for guidance. So if you're ever wondering if you're making a difference, the answer is yes. Thanks for doing it. Have a good day.